Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Social Blueprint interview. And friends, today's interview is truly a must-watch. We're all aware of all the anti-Semitism post-October 7th, and specifically on university campuses. And we are joined today from New York by a true expert, and I don't use that expression lightly, on dealing with the cross-section between freedom of speech and anti-Semitism and protest and how to handle the situation. And that's why I'm so glad to be joined by David Schizer from Columbia University. And Columbia, as many of you know, is one of the base camps for all of the protests and all of this cross-section that I mentioned before. And David is a professor for 26 years at Columbia, including Dean of the Law School for 10 years. And perhaps most relevant for right here, right now, he was a co-chair of a task force to deal with the protests and anti-Semitism. So we have really actionable items to talk about. And with that introduction, David, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Hey, David, as I mentioned, the here and the now, you recently published a paper as co-chair of a task force designed to deal with protest, and it is getting a lot of airplay at a lot of the universities. You came out with 3 basic principles. Can you discuss them, please?
I'm happy to, because the truth is, dealing with protests is difficult in practice. But I think at the level of principle, we all ought to agree about what should happen. So our task force has endorsed 3 principles. The first is free speech rights. I can express my view. You can express your view. The views might be controversial. They might even be offensive to other people. But academic communities really need to protect speech. People need to be able to pursue ideas logically and perhaps even illogically to the end. They need to explore them. And so free speech is critical. It's foundational. But that doesn't mean that anything goes, which brings us to the second principle. There are also not just free speech rights, but free speech responsibilities. So the fact that I have the right to speak doesn't allow me, Greg, to interfere with your rights to speak. So if Greg is hosting an event, I can't shout down the speaker. If Greg is putting up posters, I can't tear them down or deface them. And if Greg is teaching a class, I can't disrupt it in a way that his students don't hear him. Because otherwise, my free speech rights would come at the expense of your free speech rights, and that's not appropriate. So we have both free speech rights and we have free speech responsibilities. That second point is what US constitutional lawyers like to call the heckler's veto. There can't be a heckler's veto. You can't get in the way of other people's speech. And the way to deal with that are so-called time, place, and manner restrictions. Yes, David, you can speak. It just has to be in the right place and at the right time.
Right.
There's also a third principle, and the third principle is anti-discrimination, because our university is committed to the idea that we're open and welcoming to people of all backgrounds, and it would be inappropriate morally, and by the way, in the United States, also illegal for universities to discriminate against people based on their background, ancestry, race, ethnicity, and so on.
Got it. Now, based on these principles, you've also made recommendations. Can you discuss those as well, please?
Yes. So as Columbia was facing an increasing number of protests beginning in October, we looked for ways to apply these 3 principles successfully. And what we were seeing was protests in the lobby of academic buildings. And that was very disruptive to the students who were trying to hear what professors were saying next door in classrooms. And it was also, I think, particularly difficult for some students who disagreed with the protests to navigate their way through the protesters in order to get from class to class. So we encouraged the university to adopt what we call a speaker's corner type approach. For those who've been to Hyde Park, there's a location in Hyde Park where people can speak. And so the university adopted that idea, and we now have a central location in campus. It's for those who know Columbia, it's the sundial and the South Lawn, but the basic point is it's right in the middle of the campus. You can sign up to protest, just give the university 2 days notice. You can protest from noon to 6. Your topic, your viewpoint is irrelevant. You have the right to be there, but you can't protest in academic buildings. So that's one of our key recommendations. A second was that although we were adding rules, the university's rules were already pretty good, but they weren't enforcing them. And
Right.
enforcement is critical because rules on a page are pretty uninteresting. They don't really make a difference. And what's more, as soon as you fail to enforce rules early on, people become accustomed to the idea that the rules don't matter. And turning that around and trying to enforce them becomes more difficult later. So our first recommendation, designated spaces for protests. Our second, enforce these rules. And then our third was, please clarify the anti-discrimination rules of the university, and please also be sure that you apply them equally. One of the concerns of Jewish students was that for years, other groups had the practice of saying, this makes us uncomfortable, we find this painful, and the university and the community generally did defer to them. But then in
Right.
October, when Jewish students said, actually, that makes us uncomfortable, the analysis was different and it focused less on the feelings of the listener and more on the intentions of the speaker. And so clarity was needed, but also consistency was needed because the truth is one could focus either on the speaker or
Sure.
on the listener. That's an interesting question. We can talk about it. But what I think is not particularly difficult to see is that the same approach has to be used across the board, equal treatment. So those were our three main recommendations.
Right. And David, I certainly understand his recommendations, and they certainly seem very logical. But as you said, and it actually is a Torah value as well, where you have the judges and the enforcement, if you will. Can you explain why it's been so hard to enforce these rules? And also bear in mind, our audience may not quite understand the difference between public colleges in America and private.
Absolutely. So look, Columbia is a private university, meaning the government doesn't own it and doesn't run it. Government institutions are subject to particular rules, including our First Amendment, which protects the right to speak. The First Amendment doesn't actually apply at a private university, but we choose, Columbia chooses to apply First Amendment principles, and I'm glad we do. It's very important. But when you're privately owned, it's different, and you're really just in the same way, Greg, is that I can't come into your home and
Right.
start protesting that you could tell me to leave. A university can do the same. So the university needs to regulate all of this for the sake of its community. But then the question is, how effective are we at it, and what are we trying to do? And I really think part of the problem was that for decades we thought a particular way about
Right.
protests. I was a dean for 10 years. When people would talk about taking over my office as an act of protest, I would say, just tell me when you're coming. And
Right.
we wouldn't try to stop them. And it actually didn't really happen, but there were times we thought it might. And the basic point was if they took over my office, frankly, I had another office. I would just go there. And the point is that the easier thing to do, and in many contexts, the more responsible thing to do is just to let it play out because stopping it can raise the
The
stakes. It can
tension.
exactly. And so better just to let them say what they want to say. But there's an important premise to what I just said, which is that the costs of the protest fall on an academic administrator like me. And
Right.
they're big girls and boys, and they can take it. And so if I'm inconvenienced, what's the big deal? For the sake of the university, I can bear that because it's better than inflaming things by telling them, they have to leave and so on. But this is different, and it's different in a very
Why?
fundamental. The protests we've had since October, do not burden administrators primarily. They create real costs on other students. And those
Right.
costs include just the disruption associated with going to class. And also for Jewish and Israeli students, frankly, there have been anti-Semitic things said at these protests. And so it's burdening more than just administrators. And when you're in that position, you have to be more proactive. You can't just say, well, let them do what they're going to do, let it play out, because the costs of it playing out are falling on other students, and we can't do that. But the problem is the people who were charged with administering rules still thought the way I used to. Well, let's just let it play out. And they were
Right.
very reluctant to enforce rules. So I do think one of the services that our task force provided to the university is not just to say, enforce the rules. It's not a very helpful thing to say at the end of the day. We helped them identify 6 or 7 reasons why the rules weren't being enforced. Where were the blockages in the system? What did you need to do? What training did you need to give people? What directions did you need to give in order to change things? So just to give you one example,
Sure.
the there are people at the university who have the job of going to protests and essentially monitoring them, managing them. And the initial practice is they wouldn't intervene. Protests could break rules, they wouldn't intervene. They were just there to prevent escalation. And we encouraged them to think a bit more ambitiously about their role. And so what began to happen instead was they would approach the students and say, sorry to do this, but I just want to be sure you know that your protest violates the rules. And here's a card which includes the rule
Right.
that you're violating. And it is now 8:50 in the morning. And I'm going to take a walk for 10 minutes, but I'll be back at 9 o'clock. And at 9 o'clock, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to start taking names and there will be discipline. But my strong suggestion is just go about the rest of your day. I would be so happy if there isn't anyone here in 10 minutes. And
Right.
so this is a confrontational approach, but it is an approach that tells people what the rules are and holds them accountable. And the university started to have some success with that.
Right. Can you just tell me about timing wise? Because obviously everything is moving so quickly here. We're
Yes.
filming in May. About when did you start this practice?
Yes. So the protests began in October, and I
Yes.
would say that the enforcement was really quite ineffective through January. And it was in January, by then, we had sort of helped the university to identify these issues. And I think our enforcement got better in February and March. And then, for a range of reasons, we can talk about things changed with the encampment in mid-April. But really, we were on a good trajectory, which allowed people to protest, but in the
Right.
right time and manner.
Right. And then if you don't mind me asking, since we're here, the encampments, as you said, something changed in March, April. What was that?
So I think the point is the protests sort of escalated. And so the encampment was built, and so we can talk about that. Basically, the president went to testify in Congress. I did too.
Yes.
There were on the very same day the encampment was put in place.
Yes. I think it was
Quite
April
sure that was
17th. Yes.
not an accident, not an accident at all. I think it was meant to put President Shafiq in a difficult position. And so when you build what seem, structures on the campus, that was a clear violation of rules. And so the university needed to act. But of course, it's more difficult to have those things removed than just to tell people to leave. So it was just a harder problem.
Yeah. And that's I suppose, again, is to become the balance between practical and the letter of the law, if you will, because as you said, it was clearly a violation, but it's easier said than done.
Yes. And so ideally, what one wants to do in that situation is to get students to leave voluntarily.
Sure.
And so my own view is that universities have a great deal of leverage with students just in the form of academic discipline. Because the truth is, I'm sure that no student particularly wants to call her mother and father and say, look, I'm really sorry. I know you thought I was just going to be at the university for 8 semesters, but
Right.
it's going to be fine. And you're going to have to pay for another one. And by the way, next year I can't go. So I'm going to have to find something else to do. And so something like a suspension where the current semester doesn't count, and then you've got to uh, wait out 2 more semesters and come back. That's a pretty significant sanction. And
Right.
that alone, hopefully, persuades people to comply with rules. But I think it only works if people really believe that you're serious. And the track record of the university early on in not enforcing rules made that perhaps a less credible penalty than perhaps it should have been. And to be clear, I think that kind of sanction is appropriate as long as it's paired with the fact that people can protest. Under the
Yep.
rules, you can protest. You just have to protest the right way. I wouldn't want us to be suppressing speech. I don't think we should keep people from expressing their view, but the university absolutely needs to ensure they express it the right way that doesn't burden other people's rights to speak, teach, and learn.
Right. And David, I have to ask because, as I mentioned before, down here in Melbourne, literally today, classes at University of Melbourne have been canceled, and there are encampments, and there is a lot of strife. With the benefit of hindsight, given that we're slightly behind you, I suppose, in that way, any words of advice down here?
Yeah, look, I think when you get to the point of disruption where classes have to be canceled, and we got there too, our classes moved online, it's imperative for the university to act. You really just can't allow a small group of people to deprive everyone else of their education. And at the same time, ideally, one tries to encourage and ultimately require compliance in ways that are as collegial as possible. And so this is why I much prefer academic discipline to bringing in police. And sometimes you have to bring in police, but you really ought to try a lot of other things first, because at the end of the day, these are our students, these are our faculty members. We're a community. We don't want to create even more tension. But at the same time, it's absolutely necessary for universities to ensure that their missions can continue and students can learn.
Right. And I guess, that's a good segue to, switch maybe from the legalese into the feelings. Can you just describe what does it feel? Well, now I guess class is out, but maybe over the last number of months, that feeling on campus, especially as a Jewish person?
So there have been a number of really sad incidents on campus, and some of them were quite visible, and some of them were less visible. And so I will say that in 26 years, I've been on the Columbia faculty for 26 years. I've never seen anything like this, and it breaks my heart.
Right.
But before I get into the details, I do want to say that I don't think that the anti-Semitic sentiments that I'm about to describe are true of most people at Columbia. This is a small group, but nevertheless a very vocal group. So at protests, we've seen some really chilling things. There was one woman
Yeah.
holding up a sign. It's gotten viral, and a lot of people around the world have seen it, holding up a sign saying Al-Qassam's, Hamas's
Yeah.
military wing next target, and then pointing it at a group of Jewish Columbia students who were waving American and Israeli flags.
Right.
And look, calls to murder people are a violation of our rules and obviously should be. And it's one thing to say, I disagree with the Israeli government. I disagree with the way they're conducting this war. I object to it. Like that's a perspective people are entitled to hold and to express. But calling for the murder of their classmates, in my
Yes.
view, is simply horrible. There's another incident in the encampment where apparently 2 Jewish students were approaching, and one of the student leaders in the encampment said, "There's a Zionist approaching the encampment.
Yeah.
Form a human chain," and they basically expelled, physically barred access, and by moving the human chain forward, they pushed the Jewish students back. And look, that campus doesn't belong to a subset of the community. It's for everyone, and everyone is entitled to be everywhere. And the idea that if you're a Zionist, you're not allowed in a particular physical space in the university, it's just completely unacceptable. I mean, as a moral matter, it's completely unacceptable. And I will add that as a legal matter in the United States, we have a rule called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which
Right.
guarantees access to programs and spaces and activities for everyone without regard to race and ethnicity and national origin. So these are just two vivid examples. And part of what then happened is that student leader got maybe some additional scrutiny, and they found in his social media a moment a few months earlier when he had been saying things like, the university is lucky that I don't murder Zionists, and
Right.
Zionists have the right to live. So, so you have that white hot, horrible anti-Semitism being expressed. But I will add just a second dimension, Greg, because it doesn't get as much attention. And in ways, I find it even more painful. There are a number of Jewish and Israeli students who've been excluded by their
Yes.
peers from
I'm aware.
social groups and from student activities. Very early in the year, I know of a student a law student, who was enjoying a student activity where her job was to go be the lawyer for New York public school students when those students were suspended. They were
Right.
suspended. Columbia law student would represent them, and she was doing that, and she loved it. And then the group joined a letter, a very provocative letter. Frankly, I found it offensive, which basically the title is Oppression Breeds Resistance. And it
Right.
blamed Israel for the atrocities that Hamas committed on October 7th. And this was something that really was hurtful to her. And so she faced this terrible choice. I love this activity, but I can't be associated with this view which the activity has adopted. So she
Right.
did leave, and that's happened a lot. And I think it's really sad. And what I would say is that if it's a group that is dedicated to thinking about issues of policy, particularly Middle Eastern policy and politics, and they take a position on the war, well, that's appropriate. They can do that. But
Sure.
if you're talking about a student activity that has nothing to do with the Middle East, like defending New York public school students, or if it's an
Right.
LGBTQ plus affinity group, or if it's a dance club, and I've heard stories about that too, it's not appropriate.
Right. And I suppose also it leads to a couple of many questions, but one is what I would call education. Just some of your thoughts about, uh, I'm struggling for the right, precise question here, but there seems to be, especially, and obviously I've got the Jewish perspective of a lot of misinformation about Jewish people and about also what's going on in Gaza. And also, frankly, October 7th was a day, but we already saw issues coming up October 8th, October 9th down here in Australia that I'm sure you've probably seen them on social media. Clearly, there's a much broader issue at stake, isn't there?
So I think if everything at every university was working exactly the way it should, we wouldn't see this happening.
Right.
Because the truth is, bigotry and hate are antithetical to reason and evidence and all the things that we stand for at a
Correct.
university. So I do think there's the short term and there's the longer term. And in the short term, we need to restore a climate that lets education do its work. And that means we have to learn how to manage protests again, not to suppress points of view, but to ensure that protesters don't interfere with the rights of others and they don't discriminate. So we need that. We need to regulate protests in a way that accomplishes the three principles that I described. We also need to prevent discrimination and exclusion in student groups.
Right.
And so just doing that will get us a long way back to where we need to be. But we also need to remember that a lot of people who don't understand the history of the Middle East or the intricacies of these policy debates. And I do think that at some universities, mine as well, the people who teach in those areas often have a particular point of view. It's a very critical point of view.
Yes,
This notion that Israel is a settler colonial enterprise is, I would say, a mainstream view among the people who teach about Israel and the Middle East at Columbia.
it's a
And it would
mainstream view.
I would say that the majority of the people in the Middle Eastern Studies department hold
Right.
that view. And I think we would all benefit from a more robust conversation where other views are represented. So I should say I'm a member of the law faculty, so I'm not one of the people who will play any role in
Right.
that. But I do believe, just as a general matter, that universities are stronger when there's a diversity of views represented. And again, when we talk about speech being the best answer to speech, and I really believe it is, well, there has to be another set of voices in order to speak so that there's a real debate. So I do think we need that. And I
Right.
think generally we need to just continue to commit to the idea that students need to learn to follow evidence and to demand evidence for propositions, not to just accept orthodoxies or to follow general principles that might or might not apply. And they need to be analytical and they need to think critically. And students in Australia, students in the United
Sure.
States, they're fully capable of doing that. They're terrific. We just need to push them to do it on all issues, including these issues.
Right. And on that, because I just want to get into the detail, do you have any suggestions? Because there are a couple of points there, which is number one, is it possible that, and you've hired, I believe, 43 professors over over your tenure, so you certainly are very familiar with the system, where you have certain professors that are hiring more people that have their views, and so you create this domino effect of, as you just said, if it's a mainstream view, let's just say it's 75% of the people holding it. I'm just using a number. It just becomes a self-reinforcing policy.
Yes, I have a dear friend who's one of the people who hired me onto the faculty years ago, and his critical take on on faculty hiring generally is the risk that we tend to be more persuaded by people who believe what we believe,
Of
and so
course.
then we confuse that with better quality, right? Oh, that's an idea that sounds like my idea. We should hire that person, and
Right.
it takes self-discipline to prevent yourself from feeling that way and just to try to evaluate a candidate based on what they would contribute and their skills and their insights without almost unintentionally giving them an extra plus just because they sound like us. And this is a really important thing to do. And I do believe that we, when I was dean, we were, I think, pretty successful in doing that at the law school. But it takes a real commitment and it takes effort. And I do think academic departments run the risk of sliding into this self-replication through appointments. And it's a way that departments become weaker, frankly.
Yeah, and I suppose it leads itself to maybe as a another path for the university. And when I say university, I'm using Columbia interchangeably with all universities to take is something about that there needs to be measurable, diverse opinions, if you will.
So look, I am a fan of this idea, and I don't think it's hard to see that the spectrum of opinion at universities is often pretty different from the spectrum of opinion in society as a whole. And I'm not saying that they should match perfectly, and I'm not talking about the Middle East anymore. We could
Sure.
be talking about any issue. It's just, I think, product of the fact that this self-replication, unintentional in most cases, goes on, and it tends to create a debate that doesn't match the debate in the wider world. And when that's true, I think we lose something.
Yeah, for sure. Slightly different tactic now. When you said truth and finding evidence-based critical thinking, which is so important, I'm not sure where the line is between what you would call hate speech and freedom of speech, but certainly it appears, and obviously you can't just take Instagram on itself because that could be a moment in time. But it certainly seems that there is quite a bit of hate speech by a normal person's reaction. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So I remember my first year in law school. I was still learning how to make an argument, and I pounded the table in class
Right,
once. And my teacher teased me for weeks about it. And she was right, because it's not the way you make an argument. We make arguments successfully when we understand our audience. We try to put ourselves in their position, figure out how they think about things, and
right,
then articulate a view in a moderate way that can appeal to them. And so there's a difference between advocacy that can be effective because it's done that way, on the one hand, and just making ourselves feel good by shouting and venting.
right.
My view is that a protest that says anti-Semitic things and says outrageous things is pretty unlikely to persuade anyone who's not already at the protest. And
Yeah,
the protest is therapeutic in that sense. Maybe it's helping the people who are there. But if the goal is to try to persuade people, it's not done that way. And so I do think that just as a matter of education, we need to help young people realize that feeling strongly about something is fine, but that's not the same as making an argument that will help other people feel strongly as well. My boss, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, used to say,
yes.
you can disagree without being disagreeable. And so I think that there are, matters of tone and tactics that could be really valuable to any protest movement. And I'm not sure that we're seeing them implemented in quite that way. So I do think there's that. And I think more generally, democratic societies function in a healthy way when we don't have competing camps. We have individuals and groups with shifting coalitions. So Greg and I might disagree on one issue, but on another issue, we might agree. And it seems to me that among young people, they've lost that insight in some cases. And their thought is
Absolutely.
this group against that group on all issues. And that is not actually the way a successful democratic society operates. So really, we also have to help people see that collegial disagreement is not only more persuasive, the point that I was making before, but it's also healthier because it preserves the possibility that people who disagree on issue A will work together and fight together for issue B. And that's the way, great countries work.
Yeah, and it's such an important point because critical thinking, which is really what kids should learn at university as much as anything else, it seems, as you said, that you can almost paint somebody into a corner by one thought alone, and and it just seems like lazy thinking, if you will.
And I think that is exactly the right way to describe it. If you have uh, an ideology that generates a result every time, then I suppose it spares you the trouble of actually mastering facts and thinking through subtleties. So it's easy, but that doesn't mean that it produces answers that should guide you, because in a lot of cases, the world is more complicated than kind of a, you know, bright line, black and white sort of view of the world, which is often very misleading. But I will say, when I was 20 years old, I
Right.
did have all the answers. I knew everything. I was right about everything. And the odd thing is that all these years later, I'm 55 now, things don't seem as clear. So I guess, Greg, I've gotten stupider with age.
Yeah, but I actually wonder, is this an opportunity? As you said, that a lot of professors, a lot of faculty do have a very strong view, but is it possible that surely they could understand that you may disagree on one issue, but you may have a lot more in common on other issues, and to really try to work on that point alone?
Sure. And I will say, I think just by virtue of stage in life, faculty members tend to be much more sensitive to the idea that the world is nuanced and that
Yeah,
ideas need to be explored. And the usual pattern in academia is collegial disagreement. So I do think, and I'm not saying that this is true of everyone, and of
of
course
course.
it's not, But I think academic norms, as modeled by the faculty, need to be we disagree, but we learn from each other and we talk it through. And I think most faculty are very eager to do that. And so part of what I'm seeing on campuses is maybe more student driven in that respect, in terms of the passions of students and the the feeling that there's only one side to an issue.
Yeah. And speaking of one side, David, there's also, as you said, there's a big skew between generations of their view on Israel and Palestine and and what is going on. And certainly, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but heavily below people below 30 years old, they have very, very different views than they do above 30 years old. So clearly, there is something going on, whether it's just learning on TikTok or something of that nature. Any thoughts on that matter?
So it's clearly the case, and it troubles me as someone who cares about Israel and wants people to understand the great value that Israel brings to the world. And I would say a few things about it. One is the generation in college now has grown up with TikTok, as you said. Social media is a key source of information for them. And look, it's not notorious for being nuanced and accurate. I mean, that's
Right.
not what it's there to do. So educators need to be mindful of that and try to compensate by pushing people to see the broad spectrum of arguments and views. So that's one thing. A second thing is that these young people were, they spent a lot of high school or early years in college during the pandemic, which was just a very difficult experience for young people. I think when you're already an adult, it can be very monotonous to be
Yes.
isolated from people, but it's not the same when you're a young person and you're still developing in all kinds of ways. And the fact that these folks did not interact face to face, day to day with many of their peers, it was painful. But I think it also, in ways, it's something they'll have to overcome. And so the kind of empathy that you develop from face-to-face interactions, maybe in some is still developing, and maybe they're not quite where they need to be. So I would say you have these two developmental factors that are relevant. And then I'll also say that progressive politics, at least in the United States, has become very focused on identity in a way
Right.
that wasn't as true. And personally, I have real reservations about that. And I understand the goals of helping vulnerable populations, and I'm fully supportive of that. But I don't actually think the way to do it is to think about the world as teams,
Right.
oppressor. It causes you to miss the subtleties, and it also, as I was saying before, it turns out not to be an effective way to make arguments that reach a majority of people.
Yeah, no, no, certainly on that side. And development, obviously, it's so important. I'm taking a big sharp turn here, but you mentioned her before, RBG. You trained under her. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that? Certainly one of the most admired women in the world.
Yeah, look, I'm a political conservative. I was when she hired me. She knew that. She obviously wasn't. And just the fact that she thought it would be a good idea for me to be in her chambers in and of itself tells you something. She believed in rigor and analysis, and she never wanted to just assume the answer to anything. She wanted to track it down. And so I think she thought that I could help a bit in, and she would regularly say to me, "I'm guessing you don't agree with this. Tell me why." And I would. And, she had the benefit of that. And I'm not saying that I changed her mind or that that was the goal, but it enriched her thinking. And it, frankly, in her view, she could be more persuasive. And that brings me to the second thing about her. It wasn't just the rigor, but also the collegiality. She genuinely respected people who didn't agree with her. She was close
Right.
friends with Justice Scalia, whose views were very different. It was a true friendship on both their parts, because each respected the other's abilities, the other's patriotism, the other's seriousness. And so although they disagreed, they each, I think, thought that the other pushed them to be better at what they
Right.
did. And this is the value that I would urge all of us to adopt, which is it's not threatening when people disagree with you. It can be motivating. It can even be inspiring because it's an opportunity for you to help them see your point of view. And the third thing I'll say, so it wasn't just the rigor and it wasn't just the collegiality, but she was a magnificent advocate. And the way she did it is she could put herself in the minds of the people she wanted to persuade. And so it was never for her about, I'm going to say this because it makes me feel good. It
Right.
was always about what aspect of their views will make them most receptive to the lesson that I'm trying to teach them. And how do
Right.
I, and this is why, for example, she was able to persuade 9 elderly men on the Supreme Court to think completely differently about gender discrimination. She argued the cases that persuaded our Supreme Court to think that the Constitution required gender equality. It wasn't true before she started making those arguments, and she did it. And how did she do it? She brought cases for men. She showed situations where men were experiencing gender discrimination, and she knew that
Interesting.
that was something that male judges could, it would resonate with them in
Sure.
ways cases involving women wouldn't. So I do think that her approach to the law and her approach to life have important lessons to teach all of us today.
Right. David, people may or may not know, but your name has been thrown out. I've seen it on some interviews as a potential Supreme Court judge. Any thoughts?
Um, yes, I'm not holding my breath on that one,
Okay.
but I feel free to choose me
Got it.
for anyone who can.
I always want to end on a light note, David. Obviously, these are very, very heady times. We do appreciate your opinion. There are no easy answers, as I'm sure we can agree on that point for sure. It's not an easy time there. Any closing thoughts for people?
It is often darkest before the dawn. And I do think that we can view the current environment as painful, and it is. And we can view it as discouraging, and it is. But on the other hand, if we're given the opportunity to help open people's minds and to make the case for things that we really believe, well, that's an opportunity that we need to seize. And I believe we can do it.
David, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time over there.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.